go ahead and get started. I've heard that we're having issues with all the railroad crossings
Oh,
That's terrible.
have been blocked off.
everyone.
We've
Everyone.
been around the world to get here.
They cut the railroads. Well, if folks trickle in, we'll welcome them as they come and just tell them if they feel confused, so are we. Okay, so they're not any more lost than I am or we are. Let's start with prayer. Lord, be with you. Lord, thank you for the gift of this beautiful day. Thank you for the sunshine. Thank you for our community and for our ability to come together and worship. Lord, you've set before us a challenging group of passages today. Help us to embrace the incongruity and confusion that we sometimes feel, and the knowledge that you are in us and moving through us and growing in faith. Amen. Okay, so we're only covering 3 verses today. 3 verses, believe it or not. But I think somehow we're still going to run out of time. So the 3 verses that we have today are some of the 3 most challenging passages, 3 verses in the New Testament. And so we're gonna unpack those, get pruning in those, and see what we can learn. So let me start with Mark 4 verse 10. Mark 4 verse 10. And when he was alone, when Jesus was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. Right. So remember that this is last week we talked about the parable of the sower. Right. And so now, as was the pattern in different times in the Gospels, Jesus unpacks the parables for the disciples, sometimes in the midst of the crowd, and sometimes in private. Those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the mystery of the dominion of God, but to those outside everything happens in parables, in order that in their looking they may look but not see, and in their hearing they may hear but not understand, lest they turn and it be forgiven them." All right, troubling passage, right? Works counter to our expectations, maybe even counter to our hopes. So let's figure out what's going on. What can we take from this? Jesus replied, this is a quote from Joel Marcus, "In its strange harshness is one of the most formidable sayings in the entire New Testament." All right, so this is what Bible study is all about, right? The thing about the Sunday lectionary is it skips. You will not find a passage like this on any preaching lectionary. And there's agreement with this across political divides and theological spectrums, right? Because every church has a lectionary. Ours is an official lectionary, but then, a church that works on a series format, like Church of the Highlands or other churches, they have lectionaries too, because it's selected by the preacher. But you're not going to find it in that lectionary either, right? A passage like this. And so this is why it's good to do line by line Bible study, right? Because it can't be ignored. Every bit of it has to be grappled with. Okay, we should find it, I don't know, maybe somewhat comforting, but definitely interesting. That remember Matthew and Luke are looking at Mark when they write their Gospels, but they're aware of Mark. And in both Matthew and Luke, this statement by Jesus gets softened a little bit. Right? Now, why was that? Maybe Matthew and Luke felt just like we did. Not just like, but similarly to how we did. Maybe they have a differing group of recollections. We don't really know. But it is interesting that they softened Jesus' statement here. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of encouraging in a way. I mean, they're trying to make the Bible more palatable. So it's good in a way, except it may not be true.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. No, Philip, that's exactly right. And then and you added to it too. Mark was just like us, and Matthew just like us in this respect. Our context determines what we think and how we remember and how we write. There's no getting out of that, right? Nobody can step fully outside of their context, right? So there's something about the contextual difference that maybe could account. We don't know, but it's very helpful to speculate, I think, about what that contextual difference can be. And part of what we know is it's very likely that Mark's community, I'm going to talk about this more later, but that Mark's community is experiencing more consistent and more violent opposition than either Matthew or Luke's community. That seems to be a fairly verifiable historical fact.
They each have their own community.
Correct. So, let's think about that for a minute. We haven't used maps in a while, so I'm glad we're back to maps.
Visual aids.
Visual aids, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm saying these biblical maps. This is what keeps the college kids coming into roads. They see this right here, and they cannot get enough. You know, is it Antioch and Mediterranean or Antioch and Pisidia? Who knows? Let's talk about it. Right? They love it. Where's Tarsus? Said no one ever. Okay, so now remember that we think there's disagreement about this, but the scholarly disagreement about where Mark comes from is it either comes from Syria, Jewish / Christian / Gentile Syria, or it comes from Rome, right? There's wide disagreement about that. Marcus thinks it comes from Syria. I was taught in seminary that it came from Rome, but I'm increasingly more convinced about the Syrian, about the Syrian argument. But nobody disagrees that it's the earliest one. There's complete scholarly agreement about this. It's the earliest one. Okay. So where does Luke come from? Luke comes from less from a geographical location than a network of churches and a network of pastors. So Luke emerges from Paul's network. Does that make sense? Right, so St. Paul has his conversion experience on the road to Damascus, comes back to Jerusalem, and these lines, oh so helpfully, chart where all Paul went on his various missionary journeys, right? So all the letters of the New Testament emerge from these missionary journeys that Paul takes. Paul takes 3 different missionary journeys that we know of in Acts of the Apostles. And wherever Paul goes, he plants churches, he raises up new leadership, he has new ministry partners. Paul has a whole network of people that he's working with. And Luke comes from Paul's network. Okay? Matthew, we think, as really the most Jewish influenced part of the 3 synoptic gospels, people think has its origin closer to the Jewish dominated church in and around Judea and in and around Jerusalem. Right? And there's thoughts that John originates out of Antioch, right? So the first big kind of explosion of the church outside of Jerusalem happens in Antioch, right? So Antioch becomes the kind of Christianity always migrates. The center of Christianity is constantly migrating, but the first migration is the migration from the center of it being in Jerusalem to the center of it being in Antioch. And we think it's possible that John comes out of that Antiochian Christianity. So all that makes sense. And this is cool. This should get us going. The gospel writers are not like Ernest Hemingway, right? Imagine Hemingway waking up in the morning, definitely hungover, having a cigarette and an eye opener, and writing at his desk until midday, where he commences drinking again. But his works are the production of him at that desk, right? But the gospel is not like that. The gospels are the work of people writing things down, of authors, but they're what's come out of a community of Christians worshiping together. And so they're really products of community. And they actually have been tested in worship, right? So what happened? People gathered in worship, and they told bits of the Jesus tradition. And then somebody preached on the bits of the Jesus tradition. And as that happens over a number of years, a gospel emerges. Which is pretty cool.
Do you think people in that community got to have some input and heard some of the little bits and liked it or something like that? Or was any back and forth?
Okay, Bill, how cool is that to think about? Okay. Y'all, we are stepping deep into some well-trod but interesting theological territory here. Okay. there was a whole thing that you may have heard. I've written some. All these just say law and gospel. But okay, so there was going back into the 19th century. There was a scholarly effort to reconstruct what we call the historical Jesus, right? And that was an effort to get behind the Gospels and figure out who Jesus. What was the memory of Jesus before there were Gospels? Does that make sense? Right. So the idea was that there was a historical Jesus, and it's not saying that the Jesus of the Gospels is not historic. That's not what they're saying. That's just a descriptor of Jesus before the Gospels. When you think about the way it happened, is that Jesus lived and died and rose again, and then stories about him spread throughout the Mediterranean basin, and communities emerged who organize their life around the truth of what happened, who come to be called Christians. And there's all this, what you might call Jesus material, okay? And the Jesus material starts circulating all around these churches. And then some of that Jesus material coalesces into Mark, right?
And it was word of mouth? Kind of.
Yes, but there's two things on that. Okay, think about it this way. Think about the great story with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. All right, the disciples are leaving Jerusalem after resurrection, and they're walking to a little town outside Jerusalem called Emmaus. And Jesus comes amongst them, although they don't know who he is. And they start telling him about Jesus. Right? Well, if you think about it, what they're saying, that's Jesus material. Right?
Sure.
That's the early conversations that later are going to coalesce into a gospel. And then what happens next is that we get Luke and we get Matthew, and almost all of Mark is in Luke and Matthew, although some of it's changed, like our passage for today. But there are things that are in these that are not in Mark, right? So they come from the other bits of Jesus material, which is now lost to us. And scholars call that Q. Way before QAnon, 699. But Q is not, there's no historical Q document. Q is a theory, which says there was one bit of pre-existent Jesus material before Mark, or lots of bits of pre-existent Jesus material. But this is to me what cranks my tractor about this is that it's word of mouth, but probably more importantly, it's worship. So when the Christians gather every Sunday, which was their habit, we know that from Paul, what they're doing is they're reading from the Old Testament, they're saying prayers, they're breaking bread, they're having early kind of Eucharistics, and they're sharing remembrances of Jesus, and somebody's preaching about it. And worship is the coalescing vehicle or the coalescing instrument that takes remembrance of Jesus and makes Gospels, right? That makes the Bible. How cool is that? Right? That worship is the thing that actually does it. So does that help at all? We'll leave it on.
That's amazing.
But okay, so here's the thing. When everybody got real pumped about this historical Jesus search, like everything that's new, you kind of go overboard with it, right? It's the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. And the idea being like, well, this is just sort of all the kind of additions of the later church and so on and so forth. And if we can get back to the historical Jesus, then we'll get to the real stuff. But I don't agree with that, right? And the reason I don't agree with that is that the historical Jesus is not findable, right? It's not. That's not discoverable. It's just an idea. It's a helpful idea. And in fact, what I think is that this wild, kind of disorganized and yet beautifully organized process involving dozens of people, including the act of worship, is the means by which God chose to get us to these documents. Right? It's like this is what inspiration means. And I love that inspiration is very disordered, involves lots of people, and actually involves the testing of truth with liturgy. Right? Oh my gosh, sorry. And then the shaping of truth with liturgy. To me, that's a beautiful thing. Like in a weird way, the historical Jesus Okay, so fundamentalism as we know it emerges a little bit after the historical Jesus. Historical Jesus is more kind of enlightenment way of thinking. Fundamentalism, increasingly you might call it kind of a right wing, but they're both responses to the scientific revolution, and they're kind of both founded on the same kind of idea, right? Which is that we have to get down to what is absolutely true, that is not sort of emerged through this process of truth. I think the process of truth is ultimately what's given to us in the gospel, right? So in a weird way, I should say there's a thing called the Jesus Seminar involving theologians, and what they did is they went through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then they kind of marked out things that they thought didn't go back to the historical Jesus, right? And I think that was an earnest attempt to recover truth, but I think ultimately misguided, because I think that's not really that's not the point. And in a weird way, that's based on the same presuppositions that I think fundamentalism is based upon. So, anyway, I told you we weren't going to get through all this today. I apologize. That's a real discursive, but I think it's actually really important. Okay, this takes up the separate and yet related problems of evil and unbelief, right? So being a Christian is tricky business, right? Not only because it's difficult. When you think about Faulkner's great line, like, Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting, it's been tried and found hard.
Oh.
I love it. It's just been tried and found hard. But the intellectual exercise of being a Christian is also demanding too, right? So to believe in the God of the gospel is to believe in an all-powerful God, to believe in that God is the God of everything. And to believe in that, there is the problem of evil, right? Well, then why does evil exist? And then why does unbelief exist? Right? That's a thorny thing that faithful people have to tackle intellectually. And this is one of those passages where we have to do that. But remember, I'm really hot on Immanuel Kant, although I know very little about him. I know just enough to be dangerous. And what I understand is less than I know. So, but remember, Kant's big thing was we don't see the thing in itself. We see our categories for a thing. Right? And that, we don't totally endorse that, except that he did help us with a core insight, which is that our categories determine a lot of what we see. And so, in order to delve into these thorny issues, it's really helpful to start by examining our lenses that we bring to this question. So here's some lenses that you and I walk into this room with. There's some spectacles that we walked into this room with, and not just the ones that I can't find, but I mean the ones that are hardwired more or less into my brain. Okay, so just real quick, sort of. Just side point. I remember my dad's reading glasses and his whole reading glasses thing, like not finding them. And then I've recently moved into the reading glasses realm of things, and it's just I so powerfully feel like my dad. To the point where, like, I'm always cold, so I have a hat on, like a toboggan in the house. And I'll put my reading glasses on top of the toboggan, but you can't feel them anymore because the toboggan is covering it. And you take off the toboggan, and then you send reading glasses across the room.
That's why you have self-repair.
Yeah. And then you become your dad.
That's why they sell them at Central 3.
Yeah.
3 or 4, whatever.
And not only have I've done this multiple times, right? I've probably done this a half dozen times. Propelling reading glasses across the room. Okay.
Parker roll her eyes yet? Or?
Yes. So much that partly the other day she says, like, Dad, do you know what it means to roll your eyes? And I was like, yes. And you do too. I didn't say that, but okay. What are our lenses? One of our lenses is individualism, right? So we boil down questions into what does it mean for me? And then what does it mean for somebody else that I know, right? That's where we start. And that's not all bad, but it's not prima facie the only way that you could start thinking about a thing, right? You could start by thinking about all of humanity. You could think about the history of one group, a nation, a tribe, a family. Like, it's not the only way to start thinking about it, but it's just the way that we always start. The other is understanding. What do I mean by that? We are post-Enlightenment scientific people, thanks be to God, as I've said many times. They gave us penicillin. That's awesome. But one of the lenses of post-enlightenment scientific people is that everything can be understood. Right? That's a lens that we bring. Another is fairness. Right? We demand fairness out of life. Right? It's a big part of our cultural lens, and again, not all that bad. It's good to a large extent. But not all people all over time have been obsessed with fairness as much as we are obsessed with fairness, right? Like if we go, my friends who went to seminary in Africa, fairness is not as big a lens for them as it is for you and I. And now part of why is that? Well, they're part of a world where things are just patently not fair.
Well, who determines what it is to be fair?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like so there's a certain amount of power that you have to have before demanding fairness from life, right? So we could go to a whole thing. That's one of the things that we bring. Also, harmony. We don't like things to be incongruous, right? We don't necessarily want two things to be unresolved. So we want to harmonize them, right? We want to bring them into agreement. Except that there's so many things in life that are opposing forces, right? There's so many things upon which our common life depends that are built on opposing forces. And so why can't ideas in our minds be opposing forces, right? Like why can't that's not self-evident why that wouldn't be a helpful thing. So those are just some of the lenses that we bring that we bring to this conversation. Okay. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about what Paul says later in 2 Thessalonians. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. The mystery of lawlessness is already at work. This is what Raymond Brown, the great Catholic New Testament scholar, described as the mysterious disposition of divine providence, whereby evil is allowed to exist and work in the world.
Wow.
That's what we're talking about. The mysterious, why does God allow evil to work in the world? And then in this case, why does it seem like God is working unbelief for a larger purpose, right? And you can see how that violates a lot of our lenses and a lot of our values in modern life. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. In the Old Testament, which is very helpful to think about, God's relationship with Israel is a mystery. It's a mystery which can't be fully comprehended until the eschaton, the end of time, right? And think about how some people think for granted as a mystery. Israel are God's chosen people. Why choose Israel? We don't know. We don't know. It certainly wasn't because they're the most powerful, or the most interesting, or the most faithful, right? God chose them in God's freedom. So that's a mystery that is not resolved in the Old Testament. It's an unresolved question. Yeah, Charles.
Well, one thing that I resolved the mystery, but it is the crossroads of Africa, Europe. It's the crossroads of the world at that time.
Yeah. Right here, exactly. The navel of the world, right? The crossroads of 3 continents. So Charles, I'm glad you said that, because what we can perceive is Barr calls it the crimson thread, but I prefer the golden thread. The golden thread of God's agency and providence in the world, right? We can perceive that just like you just said. Particularly in retrospect, we can see what God was up to, what God is doing. Because in truth, the calling of Israel to be God's chosen people was to be a light unto the nations, right? To be a priest to the nations, to bring the whole world to Yahweh. That's what Isaiah says. But notice how that's an explanation, but it doesn't answer the ultimate question of why Israel, right? Could have chosen the Hittites, could have chosen the Perizzites. Why Israel? Although we can see what God is doing, we can see the method. In the same way, I'm saying we can see the method through this bit. And this is great. Now we're kind of parsing how we view providence, how we view God working through the world. Okay, so in the Old Testament, there is this tension, this paradox between divine sovereignty, right? We're not going to find passages in the Old Testament where God says, God is the God of this, but not the God of that, right? God is the God of everything. Although you kind of argue in Genesis, which is complicated. But more or less, the preponderance of Scripture is going to say that God is sovereign over all things in heaven and on earth. The Old Testament balances that with God's transcendence and inscrutability, right? So what do we mean by transcendence? We talked about it before. And this is again using some Kant's idea. The noumenal or the transcendent is what is beyond the phenomenal. So God exists in the noumenal or the transcendent realm. So God can move in here into the form of burning bushes, right? And virgin births. But we can't think our way out here, right? We can't move our way into God. So therefore, the ultimate purposes of God are to us inscrutable or transcendent. It just means beyond the phenomenal. And the word to be paired with transcendent is imminent, right? Things that can be understood are imminent. Things that are beyond our understanding are transcendent. So, what am I going to say about that? So, and that's true, right? Because what we say is Jesus of Nazareth is the fullest of revelation of God in the world, right? Jesus of Nazareth is who we needed to know about God for our life and our salvation. But there are things beyond which we cannot know or we're not meant to know, right? Which to me doesn't that make a great deal of sense of why God would become man? God would become man to show us what we were capable of knowing about God, but not everything, but not more than what we were capable of knowing, right? It was a missile of perception aimed right at a perfect target. So, but I want you to see how there is that paradox of God. That God is divinely sovereign, and yet His sovereign ways are inscrutable, ultimately unknown to us, and transcendent. Both those things are in tension. All right, and the next thing we need to think about, which is the shadow of God. The shadow of God being there is God's merciful and perfect goodness, but there also is God's. If God turns God's back upon us, there is God's wrath, right? There is God's indignation. And that gets us to the famous phrase whenever we're thinking about all of this, which is from the Exodus, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, right? There's no way to not hear that phrase without the voiceover in the Ten Commandments, right? And Pharaoh's heart was hard. Right? Now, here's something that blows our mind. We don't really know what that means. Like, wouldn't it be nice if after thousands of years worth of study, we buttoned this whole thing up? There's still active disagreement. What is meant by that, right? Did God simply harden Pharaoh's heart to make him the antagonist to Moses, right? Because he was the villain of the story? Or did God respond to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and make his heart yet more hard, right? There's a scholarly disagreement about that, and people have pitched their tent on either side of that debate. But can't you see that tension in what we're talking about? Right? What we're talking about here. And I think for me, when we come up with these questions, which people have studied for thousands of years and they can't sort of plant a flag one way or the other, I think it may be because it's both to a degree, or it's not understandable, or it's sort of beyond our ability to know. All right, I'm going to start with some questions here in a second, but I want to kind of progress through this. There's also a great bit in Isaiah 6, where in Isaiah 6, God says that after all this unbelief that's happened in Israel, God's just going to harden the hearts, and there's going to be, the Babylonians are going to come, and it's going to be terrible, but it's all in a preparation for what I'm going to do later, right? So, again, we don't like that, but there is a moment of unbelief that God is involved in order to do a greater work of belief later. I'm very into Hegel. Hegel's heard it many times. I'm destroying all my classes right now with talking about him. But he talks about this in a way I think that is helpful. Hegel talks about true theodicy, and that what he's saying is when the world is moving in this constant progression from thesis, antithesis to synthesis, in the middle of it, it's impossible to know how the details of things are actually contributing to the progression of spirit or the development of consciousness, but they are. All of it gets gathered up into this process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But it's impossible to know in the present. It can only be discerned looking backward. And that's why he says his famous phrase, the owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. Meaning that wisdom is only achievable looking backward. Because wisdom can only deal in concrete things. Wisdom can't deal in pure speculation or pure abstraction. And the great example of that was Hegel was a Prussian, and so he was not rooting for Napoleon's advance through Prussia, like a hot knife through butter. He was on the Prussian side of it. But of course, Napoleon crushed Prussia on his way to get bogged down in Russia. But Hegel said this amazing thing. Even though he was against what Napoleon was doing as a Prussian, he said other people saw a mere despot or a figure of horror, but what I saw was the world's soul on horseback. What he was saying by that is Napoleon is an agent of thesis and antithesis, and there will be a synthesis that comes out of this. And holy smokes, he was right? Because by the point of the sword, Napoleon took the parochial, serfdom-based, oligarchy, kingdom-based world of Europe and made it into the modern nation state. Right? By the point of the sword, he took equality, fraternity, liberté to the whole continent of Europe. Not in a means that we would endorse, but actually a means that we kind of cherish, now, right? Like you can see how Napoleon had a role to play in the emergence of freedom, because people are more free post-Napoleonic wars in Europe than they were pre-Napoleonic wars. So do y'all see how that? What I'm saying is that it is possible to not know how what we're experiencing now can contribute to anything good, and yet it contribute to something good later. Questions, thoughts? Yeah.
One of the problems with thesis, antithesis, synthesis is it requires a very long view. And most of the time, we don't have a long view. Something happens and it's terrible. The pandemic occurs, it's awful. But then that will produce something else, which will then produce something else. I mean, that's a very high level way to think, and most people don't think that way, including me.
Yeah, me too.
It gets lost.
Good.
But it's free. I mean, when you can, it frees you from the thesis if the thesis is bad. And in a sense, it also frees you from believing that the good is going to last. Because out of the good is going to come something bad, and then out of the bad, after following the good, is going to come something completely different that integrates the two. So being able to think that way seems like a liberating frame. It's not one of the frames you listed. We didn't list, with individualism, understanding fairness and harmony, you could list thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but it's not very common.
And Phil, it's a great reminder about there's something deeply faithful about the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which in a way, that's what we're saying when we say thy will be done on kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, right? Like, there's a larger development of good that I'm not in control of, right? But that I'm trusting. I'm trusting there is a divine process. And this is really cool to me because, I'm a big Bart guy, and Bart's whole thing is God is an event, right? We're always thinking of God as a bearded man in the sky, but God is an event, right? And then later, Eberhard Jungel, who was a Bardian, developed that into saying God's being is becoming. Like God's being is moving, developing through history. right? And then you get to that amazing bit that I always go back to. It's like every fourth one of my sermons because it's so important to me, right? When Moses asks for God's name and he says, what I am. My being is in becoming, right? The only way you're going to know who I am is if you actually trust what I'm telling you and you go out and do it. Because if you think about it, what God is telling Moses is a pretty absurd thesis. You're going to be able to tell the most powerful man on earth that you're walking off with his labor force. It's going to provoke a heck of an antithesis. Right? But that's what he's telling, right? Like, I will be who I am in my using of you to liberate my people. And I think that's the ultimate move of faith that we're trying to make. Is trusting in God through the confusing data of the world. Yeah, Charles.
Translating that, they left it a little bit ambiguous. So you translate I am who I am, or I let be what I let be.
Yeah, that's right. Doesn't that feed into this right here? I let be what I will let be.
Yeah.
Right?
It seems to me that we see that in like ever enlarging concentric circles of time. Like we might see the thesis, antithesis, synthesis in like a relationship. We might see it over our lifetime in experiences of society or community. But then we also see it through history in like big events and big things. And so it seems like we get those little experiences of it so that we can have a personal understanding of what those larger events over time mean, and give us a little bit of that experience to help us understand.
Yeah, agreed. And that's that's another thing that Hegel talks about in terms of consciousness, about how knowledge and experience always gets integrated fully into a person, such that it seems lost, but it's not lost. Right? When you think about how that always works, right? When you learn something, like something new, like you're talking about it, you're excited about it, but 3 or 4 years from now, you may not be thinking about it or excited about it. It's been integrated into what you're thinking, and you're building upon it. And the kingdom of God, or time, or the development of spirit, whatever you call it, can work the same way. I mean, I've been thinking recently, and I'm not. We're too close to this to say that this is a definitive thing, right? Like the Napoleonic Wars just got comprehensible. That happened like last week. But you think about who would have predicted that following, you got World War I and then World War II, right on the heels of World War I. I mean, the two great global wars. Which is not true, because the French-Indian War was kind of a global war. But so you really, if you think about the French-Indian War, starts an era of like metastasized global war that goes from the 18th century all the way to World War II, which it kind of is its most intense version. And then, who would have predicted, particularly with the advent of nuclear weapons, 80 years without major power war? And it's pretty astounding that we've had 80 years without major power war. And so the question is, again, I haven't figured out because no one's got it figured out. How did that experience factor into that, and what's emerging from that? We don't know. It's not knowable, but at this point, it's a very interesting data point that we have 80 years without sort of global war on the scale. And also, who could have predicted that mutual assured destruction was an effective deterrent for as long as it has been in the nuclear age? I mean, it seems wild that has been an effective deterrent. But I think so. All this is really good for the living of our days in a certain sense, because it means we can step off of the delusion of control in a lot of ways. And also, it helps us respect the consciences of others and have a category for that we don't know. Let's just take it in real concrete terms, right? You think about when your sibling or your friend is marrying somebody, right? And you have real reservations, right? It's not the time to say, like, this will not work out. Because you don't know that. It's actually not possible to know, right? Who hasn't had a friend who married somebody that you weren't sure about, and then it turns out that they've got a great, it's not knowable, right? But it would be fearfully and prayerfully, in the context of a close relationship, to ask a fair question, right? Like, how are y'all, or what are you thinking, or that's fair, and it's fair on a number of different levels, because it admits that I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not Nostradamus. I'm not the prognosticator. I'm not the Lord of the present. Right? Because those things are going to become clear as they kind of develop. It's a silly example, but I think it's what we mean. All right, I've got to pile through some stuff, and then we'll talk at the end. Paul makes a similar argument to see what's going on in Romans 4, which is that Paul says that God has hardened the hearts of Israel, more or less, in order to bring the Gentiles in. It's a fascinating argument, right? Because remember, Jew-Gentile is such a big splitter, right? That what Paul is saying is like, yeah, I mean, as long as we're bringing Gentiles in, we're not going to bring the Jews in this moment. But eventually what's going to happen is when the Gentiles come in, then the Jews will come in later. They'll be provoked to jealousy, as Paul said, which now looks to us that's kind of naive, but he's doing his best prognostication, into the future. But the Spirit was up to something. Paul was up to something. I mean, who could have predicted in 1860 or 1760? Who could have predicted in the 1960s the documents that would come out of Vatican II? Right? Who could have predicted the statements about the people of Israel that came out of Vatican II? The place of the people of Israel within the life of faith that those came. Like those were earth-shattering changes that we now kind of take for granted, but they were massive changes. And it was the instance of a kind of coming together, right, of Christianity and Judaism. Right? So taking the long view, you can see what God was doing with Paul's analogy there. Okay, but we should also say this. Now, how do we square what Jesus says in Mark 4 with what Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, 3 through 4? This is good and it is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. Right? How do we square those things? They are to a degree in tension. They're to a degree in tension. But my way of thinking is they're in tension for a reason. Right? I don't know that they can be fully squared. Perhaps what Jesus is talking about in Romans 4 is a moment in the development toward what Paul is talking in 1 Timothy later, right? It's a progression toward, possibly, but also maybe it's meant to be a tension. And this is cool too, right? If salvation is to some degree, at least in what God intends to do about it, a mystery of God, it definitely can't be my work. Maybe that's kind of what Charles said, right? It's kind of the method to what's going on, right? If I can't fully get my mind around it, maybe all I'm supposed to do is accept it as a gift. Maybe that's part of the whole method here, the whole part of the program. And also you can see, right, the great split of the Reformation. Lutheranism goes this way, Anglicanism with it, and Calvinism goes this way. It's sort of about this, right? Does that make? It's sort of picking a side on this conversation. All right, let me add that to it. If we accept what Jesus has said, then we can actually say the opposition to Jesus that's growing in the first 4 chapters of Mark's Gospel is actually a response to the invasion of the dominion of God. Right? Because you would actually be able to, you could say, if the dominion of God is being opposed by people, that's evidence that it's not working. But from this paradigm, it's actually evidence that it is working. Because that's a moment into the whole world's dominion, right? The whole world becoming a dominion. It's a moment in the development. That makes me think about a quote from Ephesians 6, which is super important. Paul says, "For we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual host of wickedness in the heavenly places." And as Joel Marcus says, the demons do not do their work without God's permission. So even the demons have a role to play in the economy of salvation, of bringing heaven to earth. And that's got precedent too, right? Think about what we talked about a few weeks ago in the book of Job. In the heavenly court, there's the accuser, Hashatan, who seems to be permitted to do this wickedness to Job for a larger purpose. Okay, so let's think about the context and then we'll pause for questions. It was really troubling for the early Christians that the Jews did not receive the gospel in large numbers, right? Because the hope, the expectation was that when the Messiah comes, the Messiah's people will jump on board with this. So it was deeply troubling to them. It was deeply troubling to Paul. So that's in this context, right? So if it's happening, it's not an accident. It's actually part of the program. That's what Paul's claim is. And then let's also think about what's going on with Mark's community. This is a theological work of a community without power, suffering oppression, like the community that produced the book of Revelation. And there's something actually very gospel about it, right? So if you're in a community where every now and then the Gentiles come in and harass you, and harass your family, occasionally kill you, and then during the Jewish war, the Jews come in and harass you, and occasionally kill you, that's a very stressful place to be in. And there's one way to respond to that, right, which is to pick up the sword yourself and join the fray. There's another very powerful gospel way, which is to say, this is actually all part of God's plan for bringing the dominion of God to the world. Even this, God is going to work through. It's not actually them. Our quarrel is not with flesh and blood. It's with the demons who are being gathered up into God's saving work. Something actually very, very gospel, in some sense, with this viewpoint. Okay, and we should also remember, in Isaiah, like I said, Isaiah 6 is all about the sentence of insensibility. The people have been sentenced to insensibility. But remember, Isaiah builds like an amazing opera into the deep parts of Isaiah 60, the parts that find their way into Handel's Messiah, when all the nations shall come. Right? So it's a moment of hiding for a greater unveiling. Right? A moment of hiding for a greater unveiling. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Questions, thoughts about any of this stuff? Yeah, Bill, go ahead.
I'm still trying to figure out this business about the invasion of the dominion of God. Is that the Jews are saying that Jesus is invading the dominion?
No, that's what the Christians are saying. So that the dominion of God is an invasion by or above heaven, right? And that if there's opposition to it, there's a way that's critical of Christianity, which is to say, like, from the invasion, nobody's into it, right? But what the Christian response to that is like, actually, the opposition is part of what this process is, right? God is drawing out the opposition in order to claim it and ultimately to forgive it. Like a metaphor might be like drawing the enemy out into battle, right? So you can get them all collected in one place. Does that make sense?
A little bit.
So I guess another way to say it would be, okay, well, think about it this way. So it's like if you, think about college football, because that's helpful. It's dominion of God, right? But if a team's been playing really poorly, they're in a bad way, new coach comes in, and some of the leaders of that team, after a few practices, the old team, they quit, right? Well, a new coach, a coach who wants to bring a whole paradigm, is not going to say, oh, I got to change my whole program. They're going to say, good. That tells me that I've actually communicated what my expectations are. And people who want off have actually received the message, they just don't want it. But the message has been important. I think that's a super imperfect metaphor. But that's kind of what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's it.
Didn't you say earlier, in an earlier Bible study that, part of the opposition is persecution. So they're being persecuted, and because they're being persecuted, they're going all over the place to run from that persecution, and that's spreading the gospel. So there's something bad that's resulting in something good because it's spreading the gospel all over the place.
Oh man, so I said that. So think about the story. Think about the story of the Acts of the Apostles. Let me tell a story about my kids. I'm sorry, it's just you know, what are you gonna do? Very proud moment. We had an axe throwing game that was set up on Sunday night. Don't worry, it wasn't like a sharp axe. It was a foam. It was a plastic thing, and it was all plastic, right? But it was an axe throwing game that the children were playing. And so they're out there, they're setting it up, and my flesh and blood, Parker Evans says, "Oh, it's the axe of the apostles." my own flesh and blood. You know, it's one of those moments in life where you're so proud, but you also want to pull her aside and be like, it's going to be a hard road, but it's going to be a good road. You know what I mean? Like, it's not all going to be roses. And this personality is going to be some hard days. Not everybody's going to be into it. You know, but it's going to work out. The other day, and Emily said to me, like, you got to help her kind of figure out, like, when is something funny and when is it, like, too much? And I said, I haven't figured that out yet, so I'm 37 years in, and I've not figured that out yet. So, okay. Think about the story of the Acts of the Apostles, just like Sandra just said. The first Christian martyr, right, the first person who dies after the death of Jesus for the sake of the gospel is Saint Stephen. And he's martyred outside of the gates, the St. Stephen Gate in Jerusalem. And we're told ominously by Luke that the people who threw their stones took their coat off, which is so grim. If you think about they're throwing it off, they're getting a good throwing motion. It's so grim. But they took off their coats and they laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul. It's beautiful, evocative writing. But after that, Jerusalem gets too dangerous for the Jesus movement, right? So what happens the very next thing? This is so cool. Talk about a new paradigm. Talk about a thesis, antithesis. Philip, one of the apostles, leaves Jerusalem and he's headed for Gaza, right? He's headed for the coast. And who does he meet on the road to Gaza? The Ethiopian eunuch. Now, the Ethiopian eunuch is African, dark-skinned African. There's been Jews in what we now call Ethiopia for a very, very long time. Judaism predates Christianity in that part of Africa. The Ethiopian eunuch was up in Jerusalem worshiping because it's a Jewish person, and he's reading the scroll of Isaiah as he comes by. And Philip says, "Do you know what you're reading?" He says, "How can I unless somebody teaches me?" Philip hops in the chariot, teaches him about Jesus, and then the eunuch says, "What's to stop me from being baptized?" Beautiful statement, right? Because it's a defensive statement. The Ethiopian eunuch is a sexual outcast, right? Number one, he's a dark-skinned Jew. The assumption is there are lots of things that would bar him from being a full part of this. Philip says, not one thing. Pull this chariot over. Let's find a ditch. This is Israel. It's not like Seattle where there's just water-filled ditches. We're talking about a muddy. We're not talking about a lot of water that would have featured in Philip's baptism, right? And so what happened? None of the apostles in the upper room, even after the day of the Holy Spirit, are saying, "Man, we got to take this ministry into Africa," right? They're probably eunuchs who want to be a part of this. No, it's like only the Holy Spirit could envision this method of spreading the gospel, right? So if St. Stephen doesn't get martyred, if Saul doesn't persecute the church, then Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch never meet on that road to Gaza. And I think that's the very thing that we're talking about, that we're talking about here. And while it does seem viciously unfair to us, right, that St. Stephen had to die, and yet Philip got to live, and John gets to live at a ripe old age, there is something beautiful about saying there is no unredeemed suffering, right? Now, it doesn't mean that every person has to know how that suffering is redeemed, because that turns the gospel into law. But there's no suffering in this world, there's no suffering in this life from a Christian perspective that is not somehow redeemable by God in an ultimate sense. That's what C.S. Lewis meant when he said the quote that I say all the time, which is that heaven, properly understood, works backward and turns the most abject pain into glory. That heaven works backward. Yeah, Terry.
So it feels like there's the danger of there being a kind of a slippery slope into that God has a plan. Like what people say when there's a bad diagnosis or whatever, it's all part of God's plan, which rubs me the wrong way. But it feels like some of this, people could devolve that into that kind of statement. So is there a way to address that?
Yes. Okay, think about it this way. the law gospel lens is very helpful here, right? Because we're all the time taking gospel, which is this big thing that we don't control, to thing that we try to make gospel into law, right? Or to be the law school. And so the idea that there is no unredeemed suffering, that's gospel, right? It says God is going to take up our life and work something out of it. Though we might not know it, and we might go to our grave not receiving it, right? That's gospel. Right? That's promise. That's a gift. We didn't earn it. We didn't fully grab hold of it. We just are comforted by it. And to take that gospel and make it into law, which is that God has a plan, and you can know that plan. If you work hard enough, or you pray hard enough, or you're faithful, that turns gospel into law, right? And I also would say, too, Providence is a first-person doctrine. So I can perceive, looking back, how things in my life, even hard things, were a part of what God is doing in my life. But that's the work prepared for me to do, right? So the same thing for you and for everybody in here. That's the work prepared for us to do. Now, friends of ours can sit with us and pray with us towards it. They can be with us in it. But it's not helpful for them to declare it in a way that is not with us, but it kind of goes over the top of us. Right? Does that make sense? And the same words said by different people mean different things, right? So it would be possible for someone to be with me in a traumatic experience, to be down in the weeds with me, to be in prayer with me, and to say to me, God has a plan in a way where it's gospel. Right? That is possible. There's a way to say where it's not gospel. Does that make sense? We're kind of head on stick and enlightening people. So it's not always the words, right? It's actually what's being conveyed through the words, and what the words are addressing that's happening between us, right? But again, think about the idea. Think about the lens that we bring into this, right? That everything is understandable. The claim that God redeems all suffering, and I can understand exactly how my suffering and your suffering is being redeemed, is sort of it's a very Western American enlightenment form of Christianity. There have been Christians all throughout the world that have lived and died who are able to say to themselves, I don't know, and yet God is doing something. Does that make faith, right? Like the Christians, that's just our struggle, because that's our lens of everything can be understood. Does that make?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And here's the thing too: faith is hard. Faith is painful. It's painful in a good way, but it's a strain. And so every now and then we cry uncle, and we take faith and make it a platitude, right? Or we transform Providence into faith, F-A-T-E. And so it's always happening, right? We're always kind of moving in and out of these things. Which, thanks be to God, none of this is dependent upon our ability to understand it. Which is great. You know?
Building on what Phil was saying, and I really just figured it's because I'm not as smart as most parents.
Not true.
And no, it really is true. Gosh, that was rude like this for me. But I always think in the Asian synthesis way. That's the only way I can to make the good and the bad be okay. You know, I mean that's the only way. And I'm often praying, saying, Lord, forgive my unbelief. Please help me through that belief. And I always hear my dad saying, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. That's the only way and I don't know if I've just been taught to think that way, but, you know, there are a lot of things that go through my head, you know, and following things and such. It's my only way to get through.
I think that's faith, and I think that's the particular experience, you know, that you've lived in life where you've learned that, you know, probably more than other people, probably more than me. And I think, like, look how you've applied. That is the teaching, right, from Paul that we need. Look how you've applied it to your life. We see through a glass darkly, meaning we can't know every single, but we will see face to face. But that will is not in this life. That will is in the New Jerusalem. That will is in the whole life to come. That will is in the redeemed life, and we can't think our way toward it. We can just trust in it. So yeah, I think that's faith. Yeah, and here was cool. Here's what I like that you're highlighting. It's just a personal thing, but it really seems like part of what Hegel is up to on this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing, is helping people who don't accept or to think about God, think about the world in a faithful way. Part of his project is like Protestant theology by other means. You know what I mean? It's a really interesting project. All right, anybody, final thought? We're ready to big questions today. Anybody had a chance to get in? Wants to get in? All right, Charles.
Just practical thinking. If anybody's heading out, and people from North Auburn may not be here because they closed off the road of Gay and College to do railroad repair work. So you had to go all the way down to Donahue, and to do that on Bragg, there's so much traffic going that way that you were going at snail's pace. That's why I was so late getting here.
All right,
If you want to get out, go down to Donahue, if you head to the north.
if you get stuck in that traffic, just think about it as a process of thesis and antithesis. So you getting home, and there will be a moment of synthesis. You will appreciate being at home more than you would have otherwise.
It's a fact of life in Auburn. You don't do road construction until football season.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all. See you next week.
Oh, yeah. Well, but that, maybe though,
What does it?
like I said,
Or supposed to be?
you live in Auburn, you understand, you don't do road construction except for